things first, you already win. You already him, you don't gotta pretend. Fuck them, you already king. You stay real, you confident in your skin. It's all now, sit in the power that you already in. This the story of a master from a true Bedouin, far away from home than few ever been. First round pick, league of the smooth gentleman. The game rigged like 50 said it's a cruel sentiment. I'm from the era when lyrics and bars is over everything. 5-star veteran. You couldn't walk in my fucking shoes or carry them. Excuse my borderline is very thin. Been married to the game like ever since maybe 2010. I realized most of y'all not serious. Point blank period. I flex and twist necks like cherry stems. Thought he was buried, but there he is, a new narrative. I keep winning. They not used to what you bringing, kid. I keep winning. Don't even know what they looking at. I keep winning. Man, yo, pick one lane and stay in that I shit. Keep winning. You came up on that hood shit. I keep winning. Nobody seeing your vision for real. I keep winning. Even your friends don't fuck with you. I keep winning. Be ready for your turn. So here's your one shot right now. What's up, everybody? This is actually episode 80, episode 80. We've been at this for a while, and I'm loving it. I'm so happy to have our guest for today. This is an old friend and someone I have a great deal of respect for, and I'm so glad he said he would jump on with me today. It's going to be a great one. And let me just jump in and introduce you to him. His name is Professor Robert Jensen. What's up, Rob?
Well, it's lovely to be here with you, Billy. Surprisingly lovely.
Surprising to be here?
No, because we've been out of touch for a while. As you said, we're old friends. We met long ago. Long enough ago that my ancient memory fades. And if you can't find my bio, I can introduce myself. So
yeah, I think you should actually. Yeah. I think you can do way better than I can.
Yeah. So the professor is kind of in the past. I'm retired now. I taught for 26 years at the University of Texas at Austin in the School of Journalism. And I loved the classroom. I loved teaching. But more importantly, what that experience gave me was an opportunity to get out in the world and to engage not only with, intellectuals and scholars, but with a lot of activists. And that's how we bumped into each other. And yes. As I was, getting ready to get on, I was reflecting on the good fortune I've had. I'm a pretty ordinary kid from Fargo, North Dakota, not a city that has produced many standout political or intellectual stars. But given that, I've had a really amazing time meeting not only people whose work I've read and was important to me, but folks like you who were on the ground doing really interesting things in alternative media, for instance. So I'm just a retired professor, still writing books, still out there, but stepping back a bit in my old age. So there's my introduction of myself.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I mean, the intro is huge. We were going to kind of get in there and learn more about you actually through the books and through the chapters. Yeah. And my first question actually, because, we're going to talk specifically about your new book, It's Debatable, talking authentically about tricky topics. You cover a wide range of things in here. I really enjoyed reading it. It was a quick read. It's only about 140 or so pages. And you start by telling us about where you're coming from, just as you did. You devoted a good, I'd say, 10 pages to that. Why is that important to you?
Well, we all realize that we have to struggle to be rational beings, to make good arguments, to marshal the evidence and come to conclusions we can defend. But it doesn't take long living out in the world to realize we're all pretty much a mess. We're a weird collection of our rational capacities and our emotional outbursts. And of course, where we come from and who we've been affects who we are. And I think it's always important to be upfront about that. Maybe one of my favorite sentences I've ever written, not to brag, but comes from that first chapter where I say the secret of my success is that I'm mediocre.
Right.
And I know it. And the reason I play with that is I come from, academic life, from university life, where everybody's, scurrying around trying to be the smartest person in the room. And I realized once I went back to do graduate work and was lucky to land a job at the University of Texas, that I was never going to be the smartest person in the room. I don't think I'm the smartest person in the room when I'm alone, even. But because I had some good friends who were good guides in this, I realized you don't have to always try to puff your chest up. You can do what you're good at. In my case, I think I was good at teaching, at taking a complex world and trying to make it understandable to 18-year-olds.
Yes.
Well, that's a skill, and I think I did it pretty well. But I think the real advantage I had is that I went into this whole endeavor not always trying to prove that I was right.
Right.
And I tell you, the older I get, the more frustrated I get with everybody running around trying to prove they're right about everything. When I make arguments, I believe in them.
Yeah.
I've worked hard to make them clear, but I've been wrong too many times to think I'm right all the time.
Yeah. Yeah, you describe and explain that very well in that intro chapter. And I think what I like about the mediocrity claim, and the position, the humility that it assumes, but also it shows me what I think is a real requirement of the intelligence in the first place, right? This ability to come up with a complex story. You have a lot of wins, you have a lot of successes, you have a lot of also things that aren't wins, you have losses and things that have been difficult, and to allow that complex story to exist and to attempt it and to give it a word like mediocre. It's a playful kind of energy. It's a freeing energy to not try to be perfect,
Yeah. And to realize what you're good at as well as what you're not so good at. And there's a lot I'm just simply not very good at.
Right.
There are limits for all of us. My
Yes.
limits are particularly pressing sometimes, it feels like. But I do think understanding your own inadequacy opens up more space for doing well what you can do well. And
I totally agree.
I used to joke about being a simple boy from the prairie coming from North Dakota, and there's something real about that. I didn't grow up in a hyper intellectual, hyper political world. I didn't get exposed to art when I was young. I didn't get exposed to politics when I was young. I grew up in an intellectually and politically rather sterile world. And so I've been overcoming that, but there are things, I'm not going to catch up on. And that's okay. We all do things. I live in a rural area now in northern New Mexico where I work on a ditch irrigation system with people. We have a very old house, which requires a lot of tradespeople. And I tell you, the respect I always had for people who know how to build things and fix things has really deepened here as I watch people who are, in the common parlance, not very sophisticated. They're not from New York, they're not from LA, they don't know the latest intellectual trends.
Right.
But
Right.
they are deeply vested in a place and very skilled at what they have spent their life learning to do. And I find them endlessly fascinating to be around. More, I hate to say it, if there are any professors or former professors listening, it's more interesting than being at a faculty meeting. That's all I can say.
I mean, that sounds easy for me to imagine, for sure. I mean, that's a wonderful thing. That's a great orientation to life, to be open and curious, and to meet someone and to know and see their value in a myriad ways, instead of like you said, the trends, the trending sort of lenses that we're all given. One of the cool things at the top of your book. Oh, are you still there?
Yes.
Okay, your picture's frozen. One of the cool things near the front of the book too, you talk about something that I don't think you use this term, but I see it as like a paradox of existence. Maybe not the paradox of existence. There's a lot of them, but one of them has to do with the interplay between like identities, which I'll call like a human limitations and separations, and then this conformity deal. So you talked about that for a bit. Could you go into that a bit more?
Yeah. So, we're all the product of a complex set of identities. I'm white, I'm Midwestern, I'm male, all of these things. And it would be absurd for me to think they don't shape not only the way I see the world, but obviously also the opportunities I've had in the world. Right? But I don't want to be reduced to them either, because in many ways there's a lot of quirky, footnotes to my life that mean it's more complicated than that. And I had a phrase I used so many times, I think students got tired of hearing it. Both things are true.
Right.
And if
Right.
both things are true, then both things are relevant. So, just take a very simple, and I hope not banal observation. Each one of us is a totally unique individual. There's never been anybody exactly like me with, my experience and my fingerprints. Okay, so I am a totally unique individual.
Mm-hmm.
And yet I am also essentially indistinguishable from the 8 billion other people on this planet. We're
Mm-hmm.
one organism,
Mm-hmm.
right?
Mm-hmm.
We're about as different as maybe ants are different. Who knows? It all depends on the point of view you're inhabiting at that moment.
Mm-hmm.
And both things are true.
Yes.
So you and I are fundamentally different in ways that are really quite important to our lives.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
you and I are basically the same organism. And I think it's trying to live in the space between those two observations that's so important. Um,
Absolutely.
never leaning only one way or the other. I mean, I'm sure, Billy, if I had $1 for every time you probably rolled your eyes when a white person said, well, we're really all just one people. It's like, yeah, right. That's usually a prelude to saying, and therefore I'm going to ignore the ways I've had
Exactly.
advantages, right?
Right. Right. Right.
On the other hand, there's something true about it, and we have to see it. So,
Yes.
life gets more complicated in a sense as you get older, not because life itself is more complicated, but you see the complications.
I totally agree. That's really well put. One of the things that I've been dealing with this question for a while, that paradox you're talking about, the duality of it, the
Mhm.
idea that they're both true. It's about the
Yeah.
story that you
Yeah.
tell. Um, to me, the way I think about it is this is a limitation of language. I think that there is a thing called reality. There is a you and there is a
Yeah.
me, and it exists beyond language. We know that words are things,
Yeah.
are labels that we attach to phenomena and to things and objects after the fact. So we're so complex. The human thing, I was raised growing up, we taught biology, and so we're like the descendants of apes, in a certain, there's a certain story that we can tell about that. But that's one story that if you think that if you believe that too seriously, you'll miss the greater majesty of what you are and what you can do. But we still need these words. And so I use a word like I call myself a man, I call myself black, I call myself American, I call myself from New York. And but that like you're saying, you're also much more than that. The words just escape us.
Yeah. Uh, you know, there was a lot of interest in academic circles, and I'm sure some of your listeners have been in classes where professors bored them to death about reality being a social construction.
Mm-hmm.
Okay,
Mm-hmm.
and as you pointed out, sure, we create categories, we create words to describe the world, and some of those are a construction in a deep sense, but we're also constrained by the reality of the world.
Mm-hmm.
There's a material reality separate from each and every one of us and separate from the human experience. And so in the book I talk about reality being constructed but constrained by material reality. So I use lots
Yeah.
of examples. I won't go into in great
Oh, we're
detail.
gonna get into some, Rob. Don't you
Yeah,
worry.
but I think again we're talking about the interplay, um, and part of the problem with at least intellectual life, and I'm going to speak specifically about the modern American, post World War II intellectual environment, is everybody's got to have a theory. Everybody's got to have their own specific way they've figured this out, and there's a kind of I guess I got theory fatigue
Mm-hmm.
in the
Mm-hmm.
academy. Everybody trying to prove that the specific way that they understand this, which probably isn't much different than the other people understand it, but it's really important.
Yeah.
And so you get these, kind of dueling theory wars.
Right.
And in the end, while they can help us understand the world, they don't define the world.
Right.
And I'm not saying intellectual life and abstract thinking and theoretical work isn't important. It's just that it has limits. And so
Yes.
we're back, living in the muck of everyday life, complex, sort of stuck often between two things that are both true.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah. I appreciate that, and I want to get into the weeds on some of the stuff that you're pointing
Okay.
to a bit further. But before even like the way you describe that is key. I think again these words that we construct, these concepts are helpful for us to understand. They're actually
Yeah.
a necessity. You know, I try to say
Yeah.
if you had a carcass of a deceased person and we're doctors,
Yeah.
if we don't have names for each of
Yeah.
these organs, we just
Yeah.
see this fleshy mass and bone, and
Yeah.
it is very helpful to be able to name things and then form our story about the interrelationship between all of these
Yeah.
things. But then it's also helpful to realize that all of these things create another corporeal, like the corporeal
Yeah.
person who was alive before they died, right? And like
Yeah.
there's this other stuff that we don't even begin to understand. There's a consciousness
Yeah.
that we can't comprehend. And even if
Yeah.
we're just on the medical table in that moment, I might focus on the skeletal thing, and
Yeah.
tell a story about just the skeletal thing, and then I'll begin to be very committed to this is what it is. And there's a whole other nervous system and the digestive thing. So
Yeah.
these stories complement each other, and I thought your book really did a great job of like giving us the opportunity and like asking us to like relax our definitions just enough to see how they weave.
Yeah. And of course, human stories vary widely depending on where people come from and what time frame they come from. So take human death, which of course is an inevitability. Every culture has devised rituals and meaning for that process of grieving and letting go of a loved one who's died. Okay.
Yes.
They aren't all the same. They're all trying to do the same thing, which is help us deal with our own mortality,
Hmm.
but they're going to be quite different. And I think we have in these ways two basic approaches. One is to say the way I do it makes sense and the way you do it is crazy.
Right. Right.
Right, which gets us nowhere in a complex multicultural world. Maybe at one point that was harmless because we lived in geographically separate areas and there wasn't global trade and this and that. But today it's a real liability to go in with that. Better to go in, of course, and say, I don't have a clue what you're talking about when you talk about the afterlife, but I'm kind of curious how you and the culture that you are rooted in came to that understanding, and what's the history of it. And then that complex story you're talking about unfolds, and everybody's better off, because if I understand your social group's approach to death, it's likely to help me deepen my own understanding of my social groups and approach
Right.
to death.
Right.
And I realize that's nice and a kind of kumbaya in a world full of tension and anger and competing for scarce resources and everything else. But
Yeah.
uh, the fact that things are hard to do, and it's hard to approach people often on, let's say, the other side of a political fence with that kind of curiosity and compassion. The fact that it's hard to do doesn't mean we should stop trying to do it.
Absolutely. Yeah, I don't think it's kumbaya at all. And I hear
Yeah,
that and I'm just like, yeah, man, amen. That's,
yeah, yeah,
amen gives it a religious connotation, but I'll just applaud
yeah,
you and say that this is, we're pointing to, I think the way we talk about it actually doesn't put enough pressure on us to get to
mhm,
achieve that. I think that the truth, I think we're pointing to a truth. The truth is a complex tapestry of a whole bunch of, and you talked about this and you had a
yeah,
chapter in this where you
yeah,
challenged the word truth, the way we talk about individual truths, right?
yeah,
Or individual narratives, but that the truth is a complex interwoven tapestry of
yeah,
all of our truths. And it's like not just like, oh, we can't do that. That's what truth is. And so
yeah,
we need to actually comport ourselves with that truth. We need to sort of
yeah,
expect that truth. The whole concept of like my definitions are what they are. That's
yeah,
the first time. That's immediately those people need to be like in another room. Well, I don't
yeah,
want to separate people, but like those
yeah,
people need to be criticized, and we need to be
yeah,
suspicious of the person who speaks this confidently.
yeah, yeah. You talked about a part in the book where I question the way in contemporary culture people have talked about their truth.
Mm-hmm.
Where if you confront someone with, let's say, an account of an interaction that was tense and led to a fight, and this is the example I use in the book, and the person says back, well, that's your truth. Well, okay, yeah, it's how I see it. but something happened between us. We had this tension, we had this argument,
Yeah.
and trying to understand better how it came to be requires us to agree on a certain kind of story about it.
Yes.
And to just say, well, you have your story, I have my story, you have your truth, I have my truth, it kind of it it says we can't resolve it.
Yeah.
And I'm not interested in just demonstrating that I have a different story than you. Uh, I'm kind of curious what's the best story the two of us can come up with. You know, we've kind of talked already several times about race, but I think this is what I learned early on reading. You know, what's it's almost difficult to say critical race theory these days, given the political charge of it. But
It's a
that's
safe
where
space here. Safe space.
that's
Don't worry.
all right. I didn't trigger you by saying critical race
Not
theory.
at
Good.
all. Not at all.
But I happen to have been in graduate school and reading and learning about race when critical race theory first came on the scene.
Mhm.
And it was exciting because it was challenging the way I understood race as a liberal white guy growing up. And uh, I didn't need to assert my truth about being white. I needed to hear what other people had to say about being white,
Yeah.
because all of a sudden then I realized what I would have called my story was woefully inadequate. And
Mm.
that's not surprising. You know, anybody who's white and given it any thought in this culture knows the story they grew up with most of the time is pretty inadequate.
Mhm.
And I grew up in, post World War II middle America. You want to talk about an inadequate story about race?
Yeah.
I didn't learn anything growing up, and I lived in a pretty much all white area, and I didn't get exposed. And so, um, we should move toward people who have a different account of the world, not because we're going to accept it whole cloth, but because that's how we learn. And that was true of my experience with feminism, where I realized my idea of how I became the man I was woefully inadequate. It had to do with race. It had to do with being an American citizen and the role of the U.S. in the world. It had to do with being an educated middle class person. All of these were important,
Mhm.
and one by one, I had to confront that the story I was telling myself was simply only part of the story.
Right.
And this is why I have such fond memories of our work together, because I'm guessing about 20 some years older than you. Um,
About
and we
that.
met when I was a professor and I'd written books and all of this kind of stuff. But I remember the excitement of working with you and the group around you, all younger, but all people I could learn something from. Uh, and that was a great time in my life,
Yeah.
where everything was up for grabs, everything was flying, and that was an exciting time, both personally and politically and intellectually.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a similar fondness for that period as well.
Hmm.
Are you saying, do you feel that this isn't up for grabs? Things have shifted in enormous ways
Hmm.
in 20 years. But tell me a bit more about your mindset in the moment then.
Well, no, I just mean that I was like a babe in the woods thinking about race, 30
Okay.
years ago. So I've had the experience now of 30, 35 years of attending to that deficiency in my
Mm,
education. And would never pretend I've got anybody who pretends they've got race in America figured out is, missing
exactly.
something. But I think I have a much better handle on how I became the person I was in racial terms.
Yeah.
Uh, and it's been painful. I've had to confront the way my family raised me. I've had to confront many of my own failures. I wrote a book that was published in '05 called The Heart of Whiteness. And part of probably the hardest part of that book was all of a sudden seeing ways that good old liberal white Bob, uh, had been a real jerk to people of color, and
Mm,
some pretty painful, you know, reassessments, because everybody wants to be the hero of the story. Nobody wants to be the villain. And there were times I was the villain. Same on questions of um, sex, gender, and figuring out, how to incorporate a feminist conception of
yeah.
myself as a man. All of those were really painful. And uh, And of course, even when you think you got it figured out, you never know when the next one's going to hit you upside the head and
Absolutely,
remind you.
man.
Yeah.
That
So,
that you don't even know anything. You know that
yeah.
everything. That's the brilliance of it. This to me has a spiritual component to it that
Yeah.
years ago when when you met me back then I wouldn't have used
Mm-hmm.
that word for myself, but I've again dealing with linguistics and how we label things, how we
Yeah.
categorize things, I've become comfortable with
Yeah.
acknowledging this as part of a broader what is. And so we're going to get into all these things, but before we do that, I actually have here
Okay.
written down, you know, one of the things you said in that chapter where you were talking about the different like truths and different narratives,
Mm.
you said it was a dead end to sort
Uh-huh.
of to be at a place where we hold that we each have
Yeah.
these different truths or different narratives. And I wanted to suggest to you, and I found that this word wasn't in your book more than I thought it would be, Rob. I thought you had some brilliant stuff in this book, but the word love,
Yeah.
I want to suggest love is a concept that allows us to transcend this difficult truth that we're pointing
Yeah.
to, that we're all in these
Yeah.
absurd, like that our truths, our narratives overlap, and then they often diverge and they don't overlap. And the way that we have the opportunity to meet again is through love,
Yeah.
which is just a word that points to a bunch of stuff, but it points to here for our purposes. It points to an openness to communication, an
Yeah.
openness to each other's language.
Yeah. It's funny you say that because a lot of people who grew up in a Christian context will remember the famous, it's First Corinthians, I don't remember the chapter and verse. Um, Faith, hope, and love, and the greatest is love.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been thinking a lot about that because I don't have a lot of hope about much of anything these days. And I don't really have faith in the traditional sense, or maybe in any sense. But I still hold on to love. Love is, in some ways, it's all we have. It's funny you mentioned that because my previous book, which is about environmental challenges that I wrote with a friend, we end this book where we've gone through all the arguments about ecological catastrophes, and we end by talking about love. And I know you're not talking about some squishy romantic love where everybody loves everybody. uh, and that reminds me of a quote I've God been spouting for I don't know how long, from the brothers Karamazov, the Russian novel,
Mm.
uh, where he says, "Love is a harsh and dreadful thing uh, in life." And I'm butchering the quote, but uh, the idea is that love in dreams is easy.
Mm.
If we talk about love in a certain easy way, but in the real world, love is a harsh and dreadful thing
Mm-hmm.
because it asks us to be truly open and honest with each other. And it asks us to look at the world as honestly as we can that are difficult to deal with, such as, in this case, we were talking about looking at the ecological challenges honestly. So, um, love is a harsh and dreadful thing, is
Yeah. It
not at odds with what you're saying. It's an
right.
embrace of what you're saying, I think.
I love that. I think it's key. Yeah, love to me, as I'm describing it, it is not a Hallmark type of love, and it's not just hugs and kisses. It is looking at what is. It is
Yeah.
looking at what is with curiosity, with acceptance, and not dissolving the self. Like you have your own definitions and identities and
Uh-huh.
your own hopes, and you bring that to what it is as you meet with another person, and that has to be part of the conversation, this vulnerability, which is why I love that you started your book with a chapter, 10 pages, like, explaining who you are,
Mhm.
framing yourself, because it all understands that
Yeah. Yeah.
our perspectives are just a part of this thing. We have
Yeah.
to
Yeah.
engage with each other.
Yeah. And there's, I said my favorite sentence is that I'm mediocre. The secret of my success is I'm
Yeah.
mediocre, and I know it. Probably my second favorite sentence I've written recently is that the moral high ground is a dangerous place to stand, even when it's warranted.
Mm,
So let's say you are 100% guaranteed you're right. You've got the moral high ground. There is just no doubt that you've taken the correct position for the correct reasons. And I think that's a very dangerous place because it leads one too often to shut down the kind of love we're talking about, and to make only judgments. And I'm not against judging people, especially people I think have sinned. We're reverting often to religious language here, which is fine with me, even though I'm not a religious person,
Yeah.
because it's very useful terminology, and we do all make mistakes. And when we do make mistakes, we should be judged. But I guess another thing as I've gotten older is I've seen how easy it is, and I include myself in this criticism, to occupy the moral high ground and lose that capacity for openness. And so it's not just because we're all wrong sometimes,
Yeah.
but because even when we're right,
Yeah.
that moral high ground is tricky ground. And
Yeah.
it gets a lot of us in a lot of trouble.
It points to another paradox, I think, that you're pointing to. It's like there's the requirement of humility because that's a requirement. You have a better lens of what reality is if you allow for the humility. But I also think that we're all intertwined in this massive, highly complex thing. We can't even begin. We can only begin to apply a few narrow words to help us. And there are people moving with intention and with confidence and with assertions of their moral high ground, whatever that is. And so we exist in that space, and the challenge, it's just a paradox because the best of us are the ones who are doing this kind of like wringing of the hands and thinking twice. This feature of thinking twice about your own fallibility is a sign, to me, is part of what is. And I try to balance it while also like accepting the paradox and the role of like needing to step into an assertion of these good values because we need it, Rob. That's why you wrote the book. You know what I mean?
Absolutely. So there's another thing where both things are true. If one doesn't have a deep sense of humility in one's own limitations, you're lost. You're going to end up being the kind of person nobody wants to talk to at a party.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
At the same time, if you sit and say, well, I don't know if I'm right, I don't know if I'm wrong, you're never likely to act in decisive ways that could be important. So you have to have the confidence of one's own judgments and one's own conclusions, at least in that moment. Otherwise, it's very hard to take risks. And
Correct.
politics is about taking risks. Right? So, here's a concrete example from my life. I was involved in the anti-war movement. After 9/11, I was part of a group, lots of groups around the country that took risks. In my case, I almost got fired. I got attacked by, I was confident that my critique of the mad rush to war the U.S. engaged in immediately after 9/11 was a huge mistake and was going to be a tragic mistake. And
you
those
were
of
right.
us who were part of the anti-war movement knew it, not just me. I mean, this was a common understanding among thousands and thousands of people in the U.S. and millions of people worldwide. Right? And so I needed the courage, the belief in my own conclusions to act. Otherwise, it would have been really easy to just, keep my head down, duck and cover. Right. But at the same time, I look back and some of, the things I thought in that period were, inaccurate at times. Sometimes I wasn't 100% on target. But in that basic idea that the U.S. engaging in a very aggressive warlike response to 9/11 was going to sow some really awful consequences. We were right about that, and I'm glad we stood up. And so that balance between humility and yet the kind of courage of your convictions is also part of the struggle. Both things are true. You got to have both, or you're lost.
Yes, I agree. We've talked about these dichotomies a few times here. We talked about paradox and balance. You have a chapter about some about reason versus emotion.
Yeah.
So if I say the word, talk to me about reason and emotion, and then talk to me about oneness or non-duality. Do these words mean anything to you?
Yeah. So we all know that we humans have the capacity for what we call reasoned thought, right? Observing the world, collecting evidence, putting that evidence together in a way that appears to explain, something we're trying to understand.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, let's call that rationality or reason. Okay, I can do it. You can do it. Everybody I've ever met can do it. Okay,
Right.
right. But even the most skilled person, the best scientist in the world, is still mostly a crazy ape, um, governed by emotions that some of them we can understand and name, and some we don't know
Mm-hmm,
how to,
mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
right? And so I was raised, as I think a lot of folks, to think that reason and emotion were somehow these separate spheres of our brain. Like reason is over here, emotion's over here.
Right.
That whole left brain, right brain. And
Right.
then you realize it's one brain in one body, one organism, right? And it's a process. So it's perfectly fine and very helpful to use the word reason to remind us that we have this capacity. It's perfectly fine to talk about emotions to remind us we're more than that. But at any given second when we're trying to understand the world, we're out there looking and thinking and reacting. uh, it's really hard to say, well, I'm going to now activate my reason capacity
Right.
and I'll check back in with you emotionally at the end of that period. I mean,
Right.
in the book, I talk about a character that a lot of, at least my generation, remembers, Mr. Spock from the original Star Trek. And that was the construction of Spock: half human, half Vulcan, half reason, half emotion. And that makes a perfectly fine, character in a 1960s, not too sophisticated science fiction television show.
Right.
But it's just not the way we are. We're
Correct.
far more than that. We are one organism always operating with all of these facilities functioning at the same time.
Functioning at the same time. All of the facilities that we can name,
Yeah.
plus countless
Yeah.
facilities that we can't name, or
Yeah.
that we haven't
Yeah.
well, studied.
Yeah.
They operate without our awareness. You talk a little
Yeah.
bit about this, and so I want to get into that for a bit because so again, non-duality.
Yeah.
It's all one thing. You talked about fast versus slow thinking, and
Yeah.
it starts to get into a place where we're challenging even the concept of free will.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I have a theory on this. I'm wondering. I'll let you start.
Well, I'll just summarize. Fast versus slow thinking isn't my term, of course. It comes from a famous psychologist who pointed out that, much like the reason emotion dichotomy, we have parts of our brain that act instinctively and very quickly, and then another part of our brain that's capable of a longer process of assessing the evidence, let's say.
Yeah.
Uh, and, I think in a way that we all understand, um, the fast brain tends to win out. But it doesn't mean that process of evaluation and slower assessment isn't useful in sometimes curbing the mistakes we made
Yeah.
with our fast brain.
Right.
Sometimes people will use the term lizard brain to talk about the most basic part of our brain, that has, really no capacity for self-reflection. Yeah, well, okay, we all have a part of our brain we can call our lizard brain, but it doesn't mean we're lizards. It doesn't
Yeah.
mean
Exactly.
we're limited to that. But this opens up, as you pointed out, a whole kind of exploration of probably one of the oldest philosophical questions in the world. To what degree do we have free will, where we are actually capable as independent agents of making decisions? And to what degree are our lives determined?
Yeah.
Well, everybody knows their life is determined to a large degree. The nutrition you got in utero when you were a baby has a lot to do with how your brain forms. It's going to affect what you can and can't do. Uh, Nobody pretends there isn't a whole lot of determinism in the world.
Sure.
Uh, but it's probably an unanswerable question about, is there a point at which we really do have something we can call free will, where we and we alone, independent of all other forces, are making choices that can truly be called ours
Right.
independently. And I'm smart enough to know that uh, a poor boy from North Dakota is not going to resolve a 4,000-year-old philosophical debate in a
I love
140-page
that.
book. But
Yeah.
it's 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 something that's always fun to chew on. Uh,
Yes.
so I, you know, probably the most interesting conversations about the philosophical debates that will never be resolved in some sense.
Yeah. I The humility is great. And we talked a second ago about these theories. So I'm about to hit you with a theory, but I'm
Okay.
pausing because I know you just said you hated these kinds of theories.
No.
Or not that you hated, that wasn't the word you used, but that these theories can become redundant and they can be battles of theories and all that. So my theory is exactly that. It is a collection of the things that have interested me
Uh-huh.
and my own personal experience. And so here it is. I think
Okay.
that, yeah, like you said, whatever we arrive at, whether I want to tell myself that I'm highly deterministic and the world has just inundated me with stuff and I'm just receiving reality, or if I have like a Donald Trump narrative where I'm the self-made man, either case is a story. It's just a collection of words, and I think that there's something powerful about how the story can lead our behavior. And so
Mhm.
I want a story because it's just a story. It doesn't matter. It's something deeper than we can understand. A story that empowers me greatly,
Yeah.
that comes with responsibility, that comes with some glory for the choices and for
Yeah.
my uniqueness, but also isn't too like dependent on all this. That just kind of
Yeah.
like I want to constantly be present. My theory is that there's only now. There's
Yeah.
only now. Our concepts of the future and the past are like delusions that we can spend a lot of time on and become really anxious about. But I want to be now. And it seems that whatever I do now, the words you're saying, I would only be able to receive them now through the lens I have now. I can only interpret it and move and be moved by it or offended by it or whatever through the lens I have now. It's all I have. And so
Yeah.
that seems to be deterministic. But I have this opportunity with that other brain that
Yeah.
I could then reflect on the experience with Robert Jensen, and
Yeah.
if I thought it was offensive, I could reflect and maybe uh like love for what
Mhm.
is. If I find something to be true, even if it hurts, it's what is. I want to love it and I want to like
Yeah.
incorporate it, and maybe it's not offensive anymore,
Yeah.
tomorrow,
Yeah.
which is a made up concept. So I think that this is my theory loosely.
Okay. All right, you got to get a very snappy name for it, and then
Okay.
you got to patent, trademark, and copyright it
Do
in
the whole
all
thing, huh?
forms. Yeah, and then you're going to move on. It's interesting because in a real conversation, no one ever knows how one is going to react. Right?
Mhm.
So I've been interviewed where I probably gave the same exact answer to questions I'd given 100 times, but this is turning out to be a really interesting conversation for me because immediately when you were talking, I don't know why, I thought of a very good friend of mine named Jim Coplin, who's now dead. He's been dead for over a decade now. He's someone I met around the age of 30 when I went back to school, and he had a profound influence on my life. He was an extraordinary person, but very quiet, not never seeking the limelight. A very intriguing person. And I think I've done some good things in my life. You talked about responsibility. I think I have often done my best to meet my responsibility as someone with a lot of privilege, a lot of advantages. Right? I've made mistakes, but in general, I can defend my life. But I often wonder what would have happened if I hadn't met that man, Jim Coplin, in 1988, because he dramatically reshaped the way I saw the world,
Mm.
uh, not by lecturing me, but through this kind of quiet love that he radiated for everybody. And I'm not the only person who has had this experience with him. And so if I get too cocky and I start thinking, well, I've written a dozen books and I'm doing this and that, I always think, yeah, and what if you hadn't met Copland? What if that one moment
Mm.
that you called an organization and he happened to be the one that answered the phone and you set up a meeting with him? Now, this isn't directly in response to anything you said. It's just what your reflections on how you see the world made me realize. I I am who I am because of all of this experience, as you're saying, uh, and it's hard to disentangle how who would I be if not any one of these things had happened. I don't know, but I wouldn't be the person I am, and that means the person I am to whatever good I've done in the world, I cannot claim sole authorship of. I didn't
Absolutely.
write my own life. you know.
Absolutely.
I end the book this way. When I make mistakes, I try to own them, right? But if I ever do anything right, my first thought is, you know, who do I owe for having done this correctly, for having made this contribution? Because it wasn't just me. And um,
That's a
it
bit, yeah.
I tell a long story I won't go into here about one way to say that, and the punchline is it wasn't me. So if anybody ever compliments me, my first reaction is to think now, following in the footsteps of a friend, it wasn't
It
me.
wasn't me.
It was something much more than me. But when I screw up, yeah, that was probably just me.
That's beautiful, man. That's the
Yeah,
beautiful impulse. I think that's the right impulse, you
yeah,
know. I think too often, just the way our societies, the institutions, the
yeah,
definitions we have, they pull us away from that. Even like even you jokingly said, you know, I had
yeah,
to copyright the theory.
yeah,
Like this is a way of this is a legal construction to
yeah,
for me to capitalize on like something that is way
yeah,
bigger than anything.
yeah,
You know, it's
yeah,
a conglomeration of all these experiences.
yeah. Now, can I argue against myself?
Of course you can go for it.
Because I think I can really imagine someone listening and saying, okay, you're 66 years old, you had a great career, you had a great job, you're probably financially comfortable in retirement, and I'm, you know, drawing Social Security and have a retirement plan and all that. So I can imagine somebody saying, well, it's real easy for you to be so magnanimous about all the people who've contributed to you. What about people who are out there hustling and haven't gotten the good job yet and have to sell themselves and have to puff themselves up a bit
Mm, mm,
and can't and have to play the game
mm.
because, you know, I'm out of the game. It's easy for me to be, you know, high and mighty. And here's my response to that. You're absolutely right. Right? That at any given moment, you know, people are in different places where the world demands different things of them. And so, you know, I was kind of poking fun at fellow professors who are always trying to prove they're so smart. But look at it from this point of view. You're a young professor, you're trying to establish a career, you just want a job. You've got to play the game where you pretend to be smart and you come up with your theory and you write your articles. And I don't begrudge people for it. I got tired of it pretty quickly, but we're all facing different challenges. And I think that's also important to remember that some of these intellectual fads and trends and all the high and mighty jargon of academics. And Chomsky did critique it, but then he said, you know, I don't want to be too harsh. You know, people have to make a living. He said, and then he paused and he said, you know, it's hard to live in this world.
Mm.
And I don't know why, but that, you know, I probably read that or heard that on an interview 35 years ago. And there was something about the deep insight and again, the compassion of somebody who was, you know, at the top of the world. Noam Chomsky, one of the smartest people around, you know, the most cited intellectual since Marx, all these kind of things. And his instinct wasn't to make fun of people
Right.
that he disagreed with. His instinct was to try and understand their motivation. And I'm not kidding. Every time I think about that and I say to myself, it's hard to live in this world, I almost tear up. There's something about it that's so profound. We've created a world that's very hard to live in. And it's another part of that humility to realize that you may think you've figured out how to live, but there's a lot of people struggling with far more obstacles than I face or ever did face. And that's another one of those things that is very true and very important.
Thanks for that. Yeah, I think that's absolutely true.
Mm,
And that room, leaving room, just leaving room.
yeah,
And there's no language will escape us on what we're talking here,
yeah,
what we're talking about.
yeah,
Leave room for what? Leave room
yeah,
for it depends, you know.
yeah,
Leave
yeah,
room. And I think that that's important. Yeah. Thanks for that. I appreciate that.
yeah.
I have here written down two more major things I wanted to talk about with
Okay,
you. And I only have about 10 minutes with you left, so I want
okay,
to make sure I hit this. But you talk about truth as a social activity in your
uh-huh,
book. And I like that chapter. I like that chapter in particular because since I've left the mainstream news, you know, as an editor
yeah,
producer in that space, I've been really trying to come up with a way to articulate a vision of like deputizing each of us,
mm-hmm,
all of us as journalists,
yeah,
recognizing in this moment that
yeah,
we have technologies that allow us to share
Yeah.
to thousands of people in a way that like an old like indie newspaper would have been begging to reach these people. So we all kind of flippantly can, and to define journalism in such a way as to mean journalists are not people employed by Fox News, right?
Yeah.
Journalists are people who use language, who employ language to articulate truth, to articulate reality, you know?
Yeah.
And with that comes the humility. With that comes this sort of uh, citation and like, you know, a little bit of like, this is what we know and this is what we don't know.
Yeah.
And so truth thinking and truth as a social activity meshes perfectly with this idea because we have the capacity now to not just understand better than like the cable news people could ever do, understand what like someone in at the particular place at the particular time can tell their story and tell us what's happening, and we can get it
Yeah.
from 16 different people who will say it in 16 different ways. That's a very complex and messy system, and yet I think it actually gives us our best chance to instead of having someone with the control of the words, you know?
Yeah. I've gone through a lot of twists and turns on how to understand media and journalism. So I was trained in a very traditional way as a newspaper journalist and accepted the way, you know, that worked. Then I developed a critique of it. And in the beginning of the so-called independent or alternative press movement, it was really exciting when communication tools, you know, cheaper ways to print and eventually the internet, streaming, things like that, opened up the fact gathering process to more people. And that was a great thing. And then we realized, however, it's not so simple as simply fact gathering, that there is, you know, a framework in which we understand things and a way we present them. And then you start realizing some of the people who now count themselves as independent or alternative journalists are crazier than anybody in the mainstream media ever was, and not any more trustworthy, in fact, far less trustworthy. And then I started to reevaluate and appreciate the way that in mainstream media, for all of its problems, all of its limitations, that commitment to trying the best you can to understand the world around you and report it with some sort of fairness, we shouldn't throw that over the edge so quickly. We should expand the number of people who we allow to do it. But that is harder than I ever imagined. And so
That principle is key.
yeah. And so, you know, we all know that journalists who work for the New York Times work within a structure. There are certain things they will never report, you know, all of that's true enough. But the work those journalists do is often very hard, very dangerous, and we are well served by it. So, you know, a diversity of voices is the only way to try and deepen your own understanding of the world, exposing yourself to that diversity of voices. It doesn't mean you have to listen to everybody. I read,
Please don't.
it's pretty pretty clear that I come from the political left, but I do read a few of the conservative, the leading conservative sites, just to see the way that what I would call that distortion happens. And I also look at left wing sites that I sometimes think are involved in an unintentional distortion themselves. So it's not that everybody's equally guilty. In my evaluation, right wing media are really dangerous in the way that they twist and distort. But it is a human failure, and therefore it's possible that our own friends and allies and comrades fail too. We've got to stay open to it.
Absolutely.
I guess my view of journalism has become a lot more complicated the older I've gotten.
I will say that it has for me as well. From outside the institution, looking at it and sort of critiquing it, to then being inside and seeing and having personal stories now. That's one thing. That's a major thing. And I'll tell you, in the process since then, it's been me challenging that. I've had to challenge that in myself. I had to say, I can't be so overwhelmed with my personal affinity for an individual where I can't like hold to that principle that you're talking about. And you're talking about the principle with the New York Times. This principle exists, And then there are also these like glaring incidences where the principle is completely discarded. But the internet is a whole new, I mean, it's a wild, wild west. And my hope, it's sort of a faith-based thing. I have to say, it's a little teleological. I think at the end of the day, somehow there will be individuals that will prove themselves to be consistent and genuine and authentic and well-meaning and seriously interested in the goal of articulating reality. And to disperse that power to me is super, super important. So there's that. The thing I wanted to get on lastly and see how much time we can rock with this is the gender question. Okay. The gender question is one that I could tell even before I got to this in your book. I could tell that there was clearly some like static and some challenges that you had come across on trying to talk about this. And then in the book, I read the book, and the chapter on this question takes you to a link to your website because you had a little bit of a challenge with the publisher on this. Do you want to start maybe telling us a little about that?
Yeah. So of course, one of the hottest political debates these days is on the question of transgender identity and political policy, public policy that goes with it. Access to female-only spaces, certain kinds of drug treatment for children, all that kind of thing. Okay, everybody knows that is a hot topic, and it gets reduced too often to a liberal left versus a conservative right. Right, and I come out of a wing of the feminist movement that has long had a challenge to the underlying assumptions and assertions of the transgender movement. That's not an attack on people who struggle with gender identity. It's a critique of the way a movement has explained and made political demands. Okay, so I started writing about this 10 years ago. 2014 was the first piece I wrote. And because the position I took was at odds with the traditional left liberal idea, I really got pushed out of a lot of left liberal circles. People I'd organized with in Austin, Texas, stopped returning my phone calls. People, made it clear I wasn't welcome in meetings and all sorts of things. And yet I've continued to write on it because I'm struggling to understand a complex question beyond the jargon that flies when you read about this. And so the chapter, I submitted the manuscript, the publisher bought it, and then kind of at the last minute, I'm pretty sure there was an internal debate within the press, and they decided they couldn't run it. But here's where the internet saved me. I could put the chapter online, make it available to readers for free, and the book could be published without it so that the press didn't have to publish something it felt uncomfortable with. Not exactly the best solution, not the most elegant way to have a book that points you to the internet, but that's what we did. And I continue to write about it and speak about it. And I continue to have tension in my own life with friends on the other side. But, it is an important issue to air disagreements on within the left. And the reason I say that is if we don't, then the right wing captures a certain kind of space, and people who are kind of uncertain about what the trans identity means, if they don't get an answer from the left that they think makes sense, the only place they know to go is the right, and then the right captures that political space.
Right.
And I think there's an internal debate on the left that has to happen. I don't expect everybody to agree with me. From experience, I know they don't. But I think and we don't have time to lay out the whole argument here, but I think the position I defend in that chapter is intellectually coherent and defensible. And if you disagree with it, that's fine, but it's not coming from Mars. It's coming from a long engagement with feminism and an attempt to create a world where people aren't hamstrung by very regressive and patriarchal notions about what it means to be a man and what it means to be a woman. So I would say I share some goals with the trans movement, but disagree with the way they proceed and the policy demands they make.
Right.
Once you get past that, sometimes people start shouting, but I am at least committed to trying to do it without shouting.
I agree. I hope we can do just a bit of that here for a little bit because I want to delve just a little deeper because I wrote something on my website called What is a Woman? in response to the movie that was done by a right-wing media organization called the Daily Wire, called What is a Woman. What I find first off is that often in these difficult conversations, I'm responding to something. So like again, there's a reality out there that is beyond our words and our concepts. And then I come into the debate in an effort to refute this, what I found to be like a malicious attack on the queer community, and in an intentional confusion. What I saw this confusion is the merger of gender and sex is to me an important confusion. And I love that your book does so much time to help us understand the value of language and words, because to me, and you do this to separate what sex is and to give it its space, you know, biological sex, the truth of what that is and what we're pointing to, and then to understand that gender is this external social relationships. It's about expectations and social categorizations that are just like the residue of old society and old thinking. It's like when I worked on Capitol Hill for a second, I used to give tours of the Capitol. They're still on the door. They separated women from men. Men and women couldn't enter the thing separately. We know that that's archaic. They leave it on the door for posterity just so we can see it, but we don't expect women to walk through that door. Right. So that is the first thing. So your critique, I thought, is kind of where I'm at. It's like we're looking at a movement, a political movement, and making an assessment. Conflate that with a dismissal of like the very real experience of gender dysphoria, let's call it.
Yeah. And so, you know, sex as a biological reality, it's binary. There's male and female. That's how, you know, human and mammalian reproduction works. There really isn't much question about that, although the trans movement tries to make it confusing. It's really not. Right. And as you point out, gender has historically in the feminist movement been used to talk about social norms imposed on that. So if you're a woman, you can't think clearly, so you can't be in a leadership role. Well, that's an old patriarchal repressive gender norm, separate from the sexual reality of male and female. Okay. Well, that's the way feminism had understood this for a long time. And the trans movement, in ways that are complicated and sometimes I think not entirely clear, play with those two terms, sex and gender, in a way that I think it confuses people more than it clarifies. Okay. So that is a lot of what I do in the book, which other writers coming from a feminist perspective have done. And then the question goes on, is the trans movement's policy demands, are those the best way to proceed to help people who have, as you use the term, gender dysphoria? That is a sense of distress about what they see as the gap between their sexed body and their conception of gender. Sometimes those people are saying, well, gender isn't really socially imposed from the outside. It's something I feel inside. That's a difference of understanding what gender is. All of these things have to be worked out. And my concern is that because this right-wing versus left-wing framing has happened, there's virtually no space left to have a conversation about what we mean by terms, right? And whether or not certain, let's say, medical practices are in fact in the best interests of children dealing with gender dysphoria. Right. All of these things are being discussed within the medical community, sometimes quietly because of the controversy around it. And I think if I've had a goal over the last 10 years, it's can we find a way to make this public without it immediately turning into that red hot intensity fueled by anger.
Yes.
You know, I'm capable of getting angry when I think people, let's say, distort my position. And I'm, you know, as suspect or subject to that as anybody. Yeah. But I've tried to work really hard to stay clear and consistent in the way I use terms and help people think through. What if there's one thing I know that kind of writing I've done has helped, is people who've told me I was really confused after I read what you wrote. I now understand the issue better. Right. They don't necessarily agree with me 100%, but they have a better understanding of what certain kinds of terms mean. You know, this is particularly easy to see the importance of in the trans debate. But there's also a chapter on race in the book where I think we have to get better at how we use terms, and not just throw around jargon.
Correct.
You know,
Correct.
jargon is a part of every group, every little subgroup.
Yeah.
We all create words to show that we're part of the group, but jargon in public discourse in a democratic society, jargon can really be the death of conversation. And so
Absolutely.
that's what I
Particularly
try to do in both those chapters.
particularly angry jargon. Jargon
Yeah.
with the intent to exclude and to determine, did you say the right word? But this
Yeah,
is
yeah,
this is kind
yeah,
of where we've been led. I think I put a lot of this to the feet of the journalist industry,
yeah,
the people who lead our conversations, who
yeah,
for reasons that have to do with profit and ratings, they want
yeah,
an exchange of heat, and
yeah,
not as much light. So what I found is what you're saying with the trans thing is like, I found non-binary to be an interesting word that really helps us focus back to gender. We're not talking about biology. We're allowing for the truth of reproductive organs and things like this. Also understanding though, Rob, there's a confusion that like gender binary is an important framework, but you also realize that like, there are exceptions to these things. Like like with everything you do, you've talked about absolutist in the book too. And so the point of like avoiding absolutism, right? Because great example is the boxer, the Algerian boxer recently,
hmm yeah,
who for all extensive purposes, for all we understand, was a woman, a female, but people are now choosing how they judge based
the
on
yeah.
chromosomes and go ahead. Mm,
But that's very different than the trans question, because that individual has what is called a DSD, differences in sexual development,
right.
and it's probably, we might have a disagreement. That person, when born, looked to be female, but internal organs and such are that, and testosterone production, all sorts of things. Uh, it's probably, from my perspective, much more accurate to, if you're going to categorize that person as a male with a difference in sex development.
Mm,
Uh, and so the advantages that come with being male, uh, which is why we have separate women's sports, of course, is because men on average have incredible advantages in strength, speed, power over women. Otherwise, we'd all compete together. Um, right. The question is, where should that person have been categorized? Right. That's not an impolite or angry question. It's an inevitable question. Everybody, if you're going to have men's and women's athletics, everybody has to fit in one or the other, or you have to create an open category. There are other options we could probably persuade. But
right.
what I think you and I would agree on is the public conversation over that degraded into uh, a real mess immediately, because there was no shared vocabulary. There was
Yes.
very
None.
little understanding about the biology. Uh, you had to read long articles that explain differences in sexual development
Yes.
and fairly complex stuff. I'm by no means a master of it, but I've tried to read enough to understand it.
Yeah.
Uh, but that doesn't fit in a tweet. It doesn't fit in a headline. It doesn't fit,
It doesn't.
in a clickbait story.
I actually wanted to actually not bring up Imani Khalif because I knew how
Yeah,
complex it was. I actually want to
yeah,
reside wholly in the social realm on this
yeah,
question and leave room for, and I know you'll agree with this. It's about leaving room for
yeah,
the complexity of the individual's
yeah,
experience with the social,
yeah,
but then comes the policy stuff with like,
yeah,
testosterone pills and surgeries and questions
yeah,
of this, and that
yeah,
that creates the tension there.
yeah,
But
yeah,
the key to this, and key to much of the book, has to do with words, and has to do with like setting that language. And I just want to thank you. I know we're out of time, man, and
yeah,
but this was a good convo, Robert. Thank you.
yeah, yeah. That's always the indication of whether something was engaging, exciting, is whether I look up and say, "Oh my God, we've been talking for an hour and nine
Yeah.
minutes." Um, but that also, um, I'm smiling because I remember when we met again a period that seems very simple in certain ways.
By comparison,
There was
for
a
sure.
lot of political debate, between Republicans and Democrats and over the war and over race. But things seemed more possible back then. And this hour for me has been re-experiencing that sense of what's possible across differences, age, race, for you and me, obviously. And so thank you very much for this. It was a real treat to hear from you, and it's been a real treat to talk to you.
I'm grateful for that, man. Thanks for that, and I hope we don't lose touch, and best of luck with everything you're doing.
You bet. Thanks, Billy.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Last things first, you already win. You already him. You don't gotta pretend. Fuck them. You already king. You stay real. You confident in your skin. It's all now. Sit in the power that you already in. This the story of a master from a true Bedouin, far away from home than few ever been. First round pick, league of the smooth gentlemen. The game rigged like 50 said it's a cruel sentiment. I'm from the era when lyrics and bars is over everything. 5-star veteran. You couldn't walk in my fucking shoes or carry them. Excuse my borderline is very thin. Been married to the game like ever since maybe 2010. I realized most of y'all not serious. Point blank period. I flex and twist necks like cherry stems. Thought he was buried, but there he is, a new narrative. I keep winning.
They not used to what you bringing, kid.
I keep winning.
They don't even know what they looking at.
I
for
keep
real.
winning.
Man, yo, pick one lane and stay in that
I
shit.
keep winning.
You came up on that hood shit.
I
my
keep
nigga, you
winning.
know, nobody seeing your vision for real.
I keep
man.
winning.
Even your friends don't fuck with you.
I
man.
keep winning.
Be ready for your turn.
So
though,
here's your
kid.
one shot right now. Your heart pounding. Clear throat right when the crowd pipe down. It's kinda like time froze on ice now. Damn, stomach tight wound, flipped upside down. Try to speak, but the words and the thought took flight now. Sweaty, but can't pause, it'll wipe down. You pray for the day you flow with a hype crowd. Now they hanging on your every word and slight sound. Maybe these critics is wrong, maybe you twice as strong. What if every fear and doubt was gone? I'm up first, bright from dawn, like fuck it with yawn. I squeeze life, pythons bite when the mic's on. Peace, I might respawn. I hook left with the right arm, living in 5-star, ring the alarm. My full nature is still greater, I'm twice born. But never the ball, that's the fucking level I'm on.
Talk to these people, man.
Picture me lost, I'm differently raw. Been through the muck, most y'all instantly barf. Now I'm strictly the boss, drippy, hood hippie couture. Feeding these bitches till it's ripping they jaws. But y'all fans of the bullshit, me flicking it off. I damage your whole clique, these clowns really pissing me off. My verse is heat, and scripted is law like bitch. You fucking know who you singing across? Huh?